Hey everyone, and welcome to our deep dive. Today, it's all about those fascinating cognitive biases, those sneaky little brain shortcuts we've all fallen prey to. We've got a ton of interesting research to get through.
Yeah, it seems like everyone's curious about how our brains can trip us up.
It's true. And think about it. Have you ever just completely frozen in the jam aisle because there are just too many options? Or maybe talked yourself into a way bigger purchase, just because it wasn't quite as expensive as that other thing you were looking at.
Oh, yeah, I've totally been there. Those are classic examples of cognitive biases in action. Our brains are trying to be efficient, but sometimes they take some, well, interesting detours.
It's like our brains are saying, hey, let's just go with the path of least resistance here.
Exactly. And that's where those biases come in. They're like mental shortcuts, rules of thumb that our brains have developed over time to help us navigate a complex world.
And a lot of what you sent over actually seems to be based on that book, Thinking Fast and Slow, right, by Daniel Kahneman.
Exactly. Kahneman's work really popularized this idea of our brains having these two systems. System one, that's our fast, intuitive, emotional system. And then there's system two, the slower, more deliberate, logical one.
So when we talk about cognitive biases, are we mostly talking about system one kind of taking the reins?
Exactly. It's when system one jumps into the driver's seat without giving system two a chance to weigh in that we tend to see those biases pop up.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's jump into an example of one of these biases in action. Cognitive dissonance. I love that fable about the fox and the grapes, where the fox is desperate for those juicy grapes, can't reach them, and then decides they must have been sour anyway.
Oh, classic. That fable perfectly illustrates cognitive dissonance. You got this clash between what we want, those delicious grapes, and reality we can't actually have them. So to ease that mental discomfort, our brains get really good at rationalizing things, changing the narrative to fit our desires.
Imagine someone who really, really wanted a job, but didn't get it. Instead of acknowledging that maybe there were some areas for improvement, they convinced themselves the job wasn't a good fit anyway.
Exactly. Or think about someone who wants to be wealthy, but also believes that all rich people are unhappy. That's a recipe for some serious dissonance. So to resolve it, they might downplay the importance of wealth, or maybe even criticize people who are financially successful.
Wow. So it's almost like a self-preservation tactic, right? Our brains trying to protect us from those uncomfortable feelings. But then how do we break free from those cycles of rationalization? How do we get real with ourselves?
It all starts with, awareness, right? The moment we can recognize that we're in that dissonance loop boom, we can actually hit pause and examine the root cause. Are we avoiding something we don't want to face? Are we clinging to beliefs that just aren't true?
Like that job seeker. Instead of writing off the job, maybe they take a step back and look at why they didn't get it. Were there areas in their interview skills they could improve? Did they do enough research on the company? That kind of honest self-reflection can be tough, but it's how we learn and grow.
Absolutely. And it can be incredibly freeing, too, because once we face those uncomfortable truths, we can actually start making more intentional choices that align with our real values, not just the ones our brains are trying to protect.
I love that. Okay, speaking of uncomfortable, let's talk about a bias I think we've all felt at some point, the spotlight effect. You know that feeling when you walk into a room late, or maybe you've got a little something on your shirt, and suddenly you're convinced everyone's staring, judging, whispering about you.
Oh, we've all been there. Our brains have a tendency to dramatically overestimate how much attention other people are paying to us. Which, makes sense, right?
Right.
We're at the center of our own universes.
Right. It's like our own little reality show playing out in our heads.
Exactly. But the reality is, most people are way too caught up in their own heads to even notice that thing we're so self-conscious about.
It's oddly comforting and a little disappointing at the same time, isn't it? Like all that worry for nothing. But it's a good reminder to be a little kinder to ourselves. We are often our own worst critics.
Couldn't agree more. That awkward moment you're replaying over and over in your head, chances are everyone else has already forgotten about it.
So true. Okay, so let's move on to a bias that can really hit our wallets. The anchoring effect. This one's fascinating to me. You gave that example of trying to guess the height of a redwood tree. And I'm thinking, okay, I have no idea, right? But here's where it gets interesting.
Yeah, because if, before you guessed, I just casually mentioned the number, say, 1,200 feet, well, now that number's stuck in your head, even though it might be totally off, your brain latches onto it.
It's like it becomes the starting point for my guess, even if it's completely random.
Exactly. And what's even wilder is that research suggests these anchors don't even have to be relevant to the situation. Like, even rolling a pair of dice, totally arbitrary, right, can influence your estimate on a completely unrelated topic.
Wait, really? That's kind of freaky. And this is where it gets a little sneaky because this bias is used all the time in sales and negotiations.
Oh, absolutely. It's everywhere. Think about that ridiculously high sticker price on a car. That's an anchor, right? It's designed to make the final negotiated price, the one you actually pay, seem like a steal. Or what about those $200 jeans strategically placed at the front of a store? Makes the $50 ones in the back seem way more reasonable, even if you never would have considered spending $50 on jeans in the first place.
It's like our brains are being subtly manipulated. So how do we combat this? Are we doomed to be swayed by whatever number is thrown at us first?
Not at all. Awareness is key. If you know the anchoring effect is at play, you can, try to set your own anchors. Before you walk into a car dealership, do your research. Figure out what a fair price is for the car you want. When you go shopping, set a budget. That way, you're less likely to get carried away by strategically placed high-priced items. Right.
It's like giving your brain that firm starting point instead of letting it be pulled around by whatever number somebody else throws at you.
Yeah.
That's such a good strategy. It's like we're taking back control of those mental shortcuts.
Exactly. And speaking of being influenced, let's talk about the halo effect. You had that great example about those two guys, Alan and Ben, same positive and negative qualities, just presented in a different order.
And people liked Alan more just because they heard his good traits first. It's wild.
It shows how powerful first impressions can be. Our brains love to create these coherent stories. So that initial halo of positive or negative traits, it colors everything that comes after.
It's like we put on those first impression glasses and suddenly everything we learn is filtered through that lens.
Right. And this plays out in so many areas of life. Think about online dating profiles. A few good photos, a witty bio, and suddenly you might be overlooking some potential red flags.
Because that halo is blinding you.
Exactly. And it's not just our personal lives. Remember the Bernie Madoff scandal?
Oh, yeah.
He built this whole reputation as a financial genius.
Right. Wall Street legend.
Exactly. And that halo, it made it so much easier for people to dismiss any warning signs. They just couldn't believe someone so successful could also be running a massive Ponzi scheme.
It's scary how easily we can be misled. So how do we make sure we're not letting those halos, those first impressions, cloud our judgment?
It's all about being aware of it and actively looking for information beyond that initial impression. Don't be afraid to ask tough questions, to dig a little deeper,
Take off those halo-tinted glasses. Okay, I want to switch gears to a bias that really messes with our understanding of probability, the gambler's fallacy. You use the example of a coin toss. Let's say we flip a coin 5 times, and each time it lands on heads. What are the odds of getting tails on the 6th flip?
Still 50-50.
Right, and yet I bet most people would say tails is due. It has to even out.
And that's exactly the gambler's fallacy. We have this deep-seated intuition that things should balance out. But each coin flip is independent. The coin doesn't remember the last 5 flips.
It's like saying, I haven't had pizza in ages, so ordering it tonight will make it rain tomorrow.
Exactly. 2 totally unrelated events. And this fallacy, it pops up everywhere. Casino games, investing, even in our judgments about other people. There was that study about asylum judges.
Oh, right. The ones who are less likely to grant asylum if they had just approved a couple of cases in a row.
Yeah, it's like they felt the need to balance things out, even though each case should have been evaluated individually.
That's a great example of how these biases can affect us, even when we're trying to be objective. So if the gambler's fallacy is about those independent events, what about times when past outcomes actually do influence the next one?
Right, we're talking about dependent events there. Like if you're drawing cards from a deck and not putting them back, the odds change with each card.
Okay, so it's about knowing when to play the odds and when to realize that the game itself has changed. So going from games of chance to those everyday decisions, let's talk about the contrast effect. That thing where those expensive car seats seem way more appealing when you're buying an $80,000 car. But if you saw those same seats priced at, say, $3,000 on their own, you'd be like, whoa, no way.
Exactly. It all comes down to context. Our brains are wired to make comparisons.
And marketers know how to play us.
Oh, they're masters at it.
So how do we make sure we're seeing those price tags for what they really are?
It's about shifting that focus from relative value to absolute value. Instead of thinking, oh, it's just a few extra bucks on top of what I'm already spending, ask yourself, would I buy this if I weren't buying anything else?
That is such a good question. It takes it out of context. So simple, but so powerful.
Right. It helps you cut through that marketing noise and assess if something is truly worth it to you.
Okay, and shifting gears one last time, I want to talk about confirmation bias. This one feels so relevant, especially in today's world.
That's a big one.
It's that tendency to, favor information that supports what we already believe, and then we just ignore anything that challenges those beliefs, like we're creating our own little echo chambers.
It's one of the most powerful biases we face. And yeah, it's everywhere these days. Social media, algorithms, news feeds. They all feed us more of what we already like, what we already agree with.
It's like we're constantly surrounding ourselves with people who agree with us, reading news that confirms our views, and then congratulating ourselves for being so well informed. But shouldn't true understanding come from, engaging with different perspectives? So how do we break out of those echo chambers and actually embrace a more, nuanced view of the world?
It's tough, but so important. I always tell people, diversify those information sources. Don't just rely on social media or one news outlet. Seek out different perspectives, especially if they make you a little uncomfortable at first.
It's like that saying, don't tear down a fence until you understand why it was built in the first place.
Exactly. Engage with those opposing views. Really try to understand where they're coming from, the arguments, the evidence. You might not change your mind, and that's okay. But at least you've opened yourself up to a new perspective, a different way of looking at things.
It's all about embracing that gray area, right?
Yeah.
Like we talked about before. Recognizing that the truth is often complex, multifaceted. There isn't always a black and white answer.
Absolutely. Thinking gray, it's about being okay with uncertainty, with holding multiple perspectives at once, even if they seem contradictory.
It's a skill, for sure, one that takes practice, especially when we feel really strongly about something.
It does, but the payoff is huge. It allows us to be more empathetic, more understanding of others, and ultimately, I think, more rational in our own thinking.
I'm all for that. Getting ready for this deep dive, I came across this bias I'd never even heard of. The Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. Have you ever, bought a new car, say it's a bright red convertible, and then suddenly you see red convertibles everywhere you look?
Oh, yeah. It's like they magically multiplied overnight. That's the frequency illusion. Not that there are actually more red convertibles, but you're just more aware of them now.
So it's not the universe messing with me, it's just my brain.
Your brain on high alert. It's that recency effect. We tend to notice things more when they're fresh in our minds. And then, of course, there's that confirmation bias creeping in again, reinforcing that idea that, yep, red convertibles are suddenly everywhere.
It all ties together, doesn't it? It's like these biases are all interconnected, influencing each other.
They really are. It's fascinating how our brains create these patterns, these shortcuts, to make sense of the world.
Speaking of shortcuts, I have to ask about the Zeigarnik effect. This one is so relatable. It's that feeling by being haunted by an unfinished task.
Yeah.
It just keeps nagging at you until you finally finish it.
The need for closure. It's powerful. Our brains just don't like loose ends.
So, any tips for how to quiet that nagging feeling? Especially when you don't have time to actually finish the task right then and there.
It's funny. The simplest trick, write it down. And I don't just mean adding it to your to-do list. Actually jot down a little plan of action, even if it's just a few bullet points.
So you're not even doing the task. You're just making a plan to tackle it later.
Exactly. And it's amazing how much that helps, because now, instead of feeling stuck, you've taken control. You've closed that loop, at least temporarily, and your brain can relax a little.
Mental decluttering.
Yeah.
I love it. Okay, one last bias to cover. This one feels like it sums up the unique challenges of modern life. The paradox of choice. You mentioned that study with the jam jars, too many options, and people actually bought less. More choices, less satisfaction. It's counterintuitive.
Right. We think more options equals more freedom, but it can actually lead to decision fatigue, that feeling of being overwhelmed. We second-guess ourselves, worry about making the wrong choice.
It's like trying to pick a show on Netflix.
Yeah.
Or a restaurant from a menu that's 5 pages long.
Yeah.
And you connected this to dating too, right?
Absolutely. Online dating, it's the paradox of choice in full effect. You're presented with this endless stream of potential partners, which sounds great in theory, but in reality, it often makes it harder to feel satisfied with your choice.
Because there's always that thought, is there someone better just a swipe away?
Exactly. It's tough to quiet that voice.
So how do we deal with this in a world where we're constantly bombarded with choices?
I think it comes down to setting boundaries. Recognizing that our brains weren't meant to process unlimited options, that might mean limiting how much time you spend browsing online, or setting a rule for yourself like, I'm only going to seriously consider 3 options, whatever works for you.
It's about choosing quality over quantity.
Exactly. And freeing yourself from that tyranny of choice.
I love that.
Hmm.
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening. It's amazing to learn about these little quirks of the human mind, those mental shortcuts that can be both helpful and, well, sometimes lead us down some interesting paths.
But the good news is awareness is key. The more we understand how our brains work, those biases we all have, the more intentional we can be in our choices, our decisions, how we interact with the world.
So to everyone listening, next time you're about to make a snap judgment or feeling overwhelmed by choices or even questioning your own perceptions, take a deep breath, remember those biases, and think gray. Thanks so much for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time.